price for what that's worth. One world, one home, only one earth. If they could reach us now, they might try to teach us how to see what we could never see from here. 'Cause it's so clear from up there looking down, we all share a common ground. No matter how good our faith or creed, with a little more love, a lot less greed, we may finally find that path back to peace, buried in the sand. Standing on the runway, 9 a.m. Look up in the sky, no sight of them. Now we won't let them die in vain if we try to see from their window pane. With the courage they had to rise above, see the world like one big love. 'Cause there ain't no price for what that's worth. We share this home, this world, our one and only earth. Standing on the runway,
Why do they hate us? And I think that's a legitimate question. There are a lot of very good American people who ask the same question. Why is it that the rest of the world seem to hate us?
They are oppressors to me. They are doing what they say they are on a war on terror, but to me they are just as much of terrorists, but they are state terrorists.
I think overwhelmingly it's a sense that they're Americans, and I don't mean individual Americans, I mean the government, that they can just do whatever they darn well please. And I think people in the world are finding that absolutely repugnant.
I think that the US government is trying to show its dictatorship. It's just trying that it wants power. It's just trying to show that we are powerful than other countries. It's trying to say that we are powerful than other countries, that you all should listen to us.
The U.S. government, as distinct from the population, they want to remain exempt from anything. They want to have total sovereignty. Nobody else should have sovereignty, but the U.S. should have ultimate sovereignty. It should have the right to do whatever it wants.
Current U.S. administration is possibly the most dangerous and most frightening we've had in a very long time, if not ever.
The hawkish Republican approach to world domination.
They don't care. As long as they want to secure the interests first, and to hell with everybody else.
طلع بالشارع العام يعني راح منها مدري بيروح للشغل. شو عنده شغل بالحديقة جيت اسمع ضربوا جابوا لها شنو هم ضرب رصاص بعد شوية جاء واحد دا يركض يقول لي أبو مازن البس هدومك وتعال ويانا. ليش؟ دا يقول لي البس هدومك وتعال ويانا. أجي كانت لي صدره بطنه برجله بإيده، يعني كان يقولون كان اكو سيارة حتى 3 مال الجيش الأمريكي دا تمشي، ما أعرف يقولون اكو سيارات أخرى مدنية دي مطاردة ضاربين طلقة، هذول رشوا على الكل. هو واقف دي ينتظر تاكسي، هو انقتل.
What do you think of that? I think eventually in time, maybe not my time, they'll wake up and see that democracy is right.
I tell them to bring themselves down here and say that to all our face right now. I don't think a lot of people would take that very likely.
I say the same thing because, I mean, why are we going to go to a different world and go fight someone else's war, you know? That's just messed up.
Pretty much anybody can talk, but back it up and see what happens.
Now, why do you think that they don't like us, though?
Because we're a free country and they wish they could be like this.
Because they're scared of democracy, I think. I think they're scared of freedom because when freedom comes, democracy comes in, then they actually got to take care of themselves and they're scared to be able to, they can't do it.
I think that over there in different countries, they're just getting to hear about our freedoms over here, and they're wanting the same things, but at the same time, you know, they want us to come in and fix their countries, and that's, you know, I mean, that's up to their countries to do that. It's not up to us.
So is that why you think they are hating us or they don't like us?
Well, I think they picked that up, you know, because we do help out a lot of different countries. And, you know, with people overseas, it's all political. You know, if one country doesn't care for individuals of another country, you know, they're not going to like us, you know, helping them out. But, you know, we try to help out everybody any way we can. But, you know, you can never make everybody happy.
The US government is actually promoting its religion, its cultures, its values, its ethos on other countries, either through trade or either forcefully, as in you saw in Iraq.
My opinion, I think they're too bombastic and they go straight forward and say we are very forceful and we are very strong. And if you don't want to give it in a nice way, we'll force our way into it and just take it.
Mr. Bush, we are here to support the thousands of concerned Americans who are protesting at this very moment against your inauguration. We are here to support the thousands of Americans who were so ashamed about your re-elections that they felt a need to apologize to the rest of the world on the website www.sorryeverybody.com. We are here to show all those people that there is no need to apologize, that there is just this need to pull together so together we can get out of the shit that you have put us in. Mr. Bush, you turned your back on the international community and international law when you illegally invaded Iraq. You turned your back on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Geneva Convention in your treatment of prisoners of war in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. For the past 4 years, you and your neoconservative gang have turned your backs on the world. Now, together with thousands of concerned American citizens, we turn our back on you. God bless you all. God bless you all.
I can't say anything about Bush that hasn't been said by 1,000 learned men. But I can say that I'm just another kid who feels the same way.
Well, Sorry Everybody is a website where American citizens took pictures of themselves and posted them with a message apologizing to the rest of the world for the re-election of Bush. It wasn't their fault, of course, but they were somehow embarrassed that they lived in a country where a majority of the voters, a small majority but still, believed in Bush and the people behind him even after all the lies they told. It's very lucky that we have such a medium where people can just express themselves very spontaneously.
I'm an American, so my first instinct when confronted with the grief and the despair and the sadness was to capitalize on it. No. Really, I thought that, like with many things that you might consider tragedies. Now, for many that's an overstatement. For many that's an understatement. For me, I'd say tragedy is about right. For many things that people consider tragedies, the best way to respond to them is with humor, black humor if necessary. And that's what Sorry Everybody originally was intended to be. I drew Sorry World, We Tried on a piece of paper just on my notebook that I use in class. And I held it up to my digital camera and took a picture on the self-timer and posted it on the web as a joke, because that's woefully insufficient, wouldn't you think? But I bought the domain name on a whim. I had $20 lying around, and threw it up there with a very, very basic site attached to it, and said, hey, send me your pictures. And long story short, by the end of the week I was on CNN, we'd had 5,000 submissions. It took off like a model rocket coated with kerosene. I originally hosted it on my USC web server that all students get access to. I received an email from the USC Tech Department later that day complaining that I'd received 2.1 million hits in the course of 3 hours and that they were taking my site down. Not for any political reasons, but because it was putting stress on their server to the tune of about 82% of their traffic. ApologiesAccepted.com was the response by a gentleman named Thijs Leidens, a Dutchman, to SorryEverybody.com. It took the website's format and duplicated it, and instead was a collection of pictures of, I'd say mostly Europeans, but people from around the world holding up signs accepting people's apologies. It was just sort of a gesture of outreach, you know, the hand touching the hand, kind of, I don't know. I thought it was really touching. We got a lot of those same submissions, those apologies accepted, those, hey, you know, we salute you from Germany, you know, here's a Heineken. And I loved every single one of them. I think that Apologies Accepted, surfing through it, hit me a lot harder than my site did. Just the feeling that something that I had initiated had really caused some kind of essential communication, something really simple, something direct, something like, it's okay. International bridges are tenuous things. They come and go like the winds. You know, we didn't used to hate France. We used to hate Germany. You know, we used to hate Japan. Now we can't get enough of them. Well, they sprung up like a fairy circle. There's just mushrooms popping up like from underneath my butt. Just, hello, I'm we'renotsorry.com. Hi, I'm sorryeverybodymyass.com. Hi, I'm you're welcome everybody. Hi, I'm we're not sorry. Hi, I am not sorry. Hi, and notsorryeverybody.com. There was even a notsorrynoteverybody.com, which was a counter site. They consisted mostly of collections of pictures of conservatives with a sort of a similar motif, holding up signs, in many instances holding up guns, and saying that they weren't sorry at all. In fact, that they were, in some cases, proud, in some cases just morbidly angry about what, I'm not sure. But the upshot is they were making fun. Underneath almost all mockery, there is a more genuine emotion, right? They were really, really angry that communication was taking place. And they felt like there was some kind of movement going on which they were just absolutely horribly opposed to. And I'm not sure if many of these people could articulate what that movement is, and I'll tell you what that movement is. That movement is peace. And there's a lot of people who have not really internalized what peace means, what it requires, what it entails. And when you get right down to it, they're against it. They would rather be at war than at peace. There's a lot of people who voted for Bush, I think, that didn't want to. And those people don't show up on the We're Not Sorry sites. We have to be careful not to think of these people in camouflages, you know, grinning toothlessly and pointing their 22s at the camera as representative of half of our country, because they're not. This isn't conservative America. These are not the people that we want to talk to. You want to talk to the ones who voted for Bush because they didn't like Kerry. Because, in all honesty, that's something I can understand.
Love will lead me over as I step across the line. Peace will be my cover as I step across the line, as I step across the line.
We have this idea in the United States that the U.S. liberated Afghanistan, that somehow we broke up all these terrorist networks and we liberated the women from the Taliban, and that people's lives are better in Afghanistan. They're not. When I first went to Afghanistan during the U.S. bombing campaign, we went in through Peshawar in Pakistan. And I'll never forget landing in Pakistan and trying to find the Afghan refugees. And on our first day there, we met a young girl who was 13 years old, which is the age of my younger daughter. And she had just made a very, very rugged and dangerous journey from Kabul to Pakistan, because her mother had been killed in the U.S. bombing, and her father lost his mind, literally, and had become mute after the death of his wife, and realized that this is just one of probably thousands of examples of people's lives destroyed by a U.S. bombing campaign in the name of both making ourselves safe at home, but liberating the Afghan people. The Afghan people have certainly not been liberated.
Terrible things have happened in Afghanistan. There's pretty good evidence that hundreds, if not thousands, of Afghan prisoners were simply slaughtered in sealed trains. and then bodies buried somewhere, and the U.S. won't allow anyone to dig them up. The Physicians for Human Rights and others have tried to investigate. They won't allow them. And it's probable that the U.S. military were at least observing and maybe participating. And that's only the beginning of it. But the U.S. holds itself immune from any investigation or prosecution. That's part of the rejection, flat rejection of international laws and conventions, or anything that would limit the U.S. right to use force whenever it wants and to carry out any acts that it wants.
Afghanistan is still one of the poorest nations in the world. 1 out of 5 Afghan children die before the age of 5. This is in contrast to what is told to the American public, that there is now a thriving democracy in Afghanistan. The reason that it's so dangerous that the American people don't get the truth about what happened in Afghanistan is it made them more open to the war in Iraq and makes people more open to war in general as a way to not only supposedly make us safe, but help liberate people around the world. And I realized how important it was to take these stories back to the American public and make them realize that anytime we bomb a country, we are destroying the lives of regular, peace-loving people who will never be the same again. There's nothing that can compensate for the loss of life. But other than what they've done here, is there something else they think the U.S. should do?
إذا أكو تقاعد خاطر أطفالهم يعني بس هاي الأول والأشياء اللي قلتها الأخرى. أنا بالنسبة لي يعني إحنا the end of our life يعني but the child يعني الأطفال تقاعد.
أصلا أنا يعني هم أنا أريد الاعتذار بس يعني أخويا ما كان شايل مسدس بإيده وأساسا هو معفي من الخدمة العسكرية مسلحة وغير مسلحة. مريض يعني ما ممكن إنه
فرحة بلبها.
يعني إحنا تناولنا الفطور سويته الصباح وتسولفنا وأخذ أغراضه وطالع للعمل. يقول لي شايل مسدس؟ لا، ويتهم يقول لي كان أخوك يطلق نار على سيارة بيك اب يحاول يسرقها.
Mazen's father said that for myself, for me, I want nothing because I am dead after my son. My life is finished. But he wants pension for his wife, his young wife, and his daughters.
Ninguna guerra está justificada, pero desgraciadamente eso se viene dando siempre por el imperialismo, ¿no? Desde los romanos, desde que el hombre es hombre se viene dando. Aquí lo grave es que se ha manipulado, se manipula que son los policías del mundo, que van a salvar al mundo, todo este tipo de estupideces que dice el presidente Bush, ¿no? Y desgraciadamente sí hay gente que lo cree en los Estados Unidos, ¿no? Son dogmáticos, son de ultraderecha y eso es grave, ¿no? Ya se ha visto, no, desgraciadamente no es el primer caso, ¿no? Ya se tiene a Hitler, ya se tiene a muchos dictadores. De una u otra forma, desgraciadamente, en el momento en el que está sucediendo, parece ser que la gente no se da cuenta, sino que tiene que pasar algunos años para que digan, oh, hubo un error, ya la volvimos a regar, ¿no? Esa es la bronca, ¿no?
Война не приносит ничего лучшего. Они просто, я не знаю, силой, я считаю, это не демократия, они силой берут все.
That has created a lot of instability in the rest of the world. I think the Americans or Mr. Bush underestimated what has happened in Iraq. He thought it was just a matter of maybe 3, 4, 5 months and it's going to be over. And it's not going to be over. It's going to take a long time because now there's a lot of terrorism pockets that will be growing in the world. And terrorism is it's a difficult war to fight.
Talking was more important than acting. And I think Europe is, for the moment, always on speaking terms with the rest of the world. and it has to stay like this. If you're not on speaking terms anymore, well, then it's finished. So I think if the Americans could speak more with the rest of the world, it could help. Well, a lot.
Right after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, knowing that the Bush administration wanted to invade Iraq and feeling like, oh my God, the American people have no idea what we did to the Afghan people, how many civilian casualties, how many lives were destroyed, and now we're about to do it again in another country. We've got to try to stop this. And we created Code Pink as a women's call that countered Bush's Code Red, Code Orange alert that's based on fear and the us versus them kind of mentality. Code Pink is based on the we are all one human family mentality, and let's not fight violence with violence. The first time we went to Iraq as Code Pink was right before the U.S. invasion. It was in February of 2003. And what we found was very different than Afghanistan. Afghanistan, the people are poor, most of them are illiterate. In Iraq, it's a very well-educated population, and women played a very vital role in society. Women you would find as doctors, as lawyers, as engineers. You saw many, many women who did not even have any kind of head covering. A very secular state. And when we were there, because it was right before the U.S. bombing campaign, and it was right at the time when George Bush had said, okay, the game is up, meaning we're not going to continue with the weapons inspections. The people of Iraq knew the bombing was going to come any day. They were terrified. And they were terrified of our government. They were terrified of our bombs. We felt so absolutely helpless and ashamed that our government was about to attack them and that there was nothing that we as citizens could do to stop them.
Events in Iraq have now reached the final days of decision. Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing.
This will be a campaign unlike any other in history. A campaign characterized by shock, by surprise, and by the application of overwhelming force.
On the President's order, coalition forces began the ground war to disarm Iraq and liberate the Iraqi people.
يعني لا يظنون العراقيين نايمين. عندنا uranium in the earth of Iraq, in Kurdish.
Let me tell you, this is not a reason, a big reason. We want to know why you came to Iraq. Why? No, not you. You're a politic. You're a command. Why came here? You said you have many reasons. Still now, you don't have anything. But look what you done. Destroyed. You destroyed all the people. Why? Because your politic is very wrong. From the beginning, when you let the people steal everything or take everything.
This all happened, okay?
This all happened. But we want to know how we can live now. How?
تقول لك انت اللي تقوله انه انت الامريكان تعمدوا يدمرون العراق حتى يبقون به حتى يخلوكم عاجزين عن تتخلون.
طبعا عطاله موجودين.
بس اسمح لي الله يخليك.
Bueno, o sea, justificada en el plan negativo, pues yo creo que sí, ¿no? Porque, pues digo, se supone que este Bush se está beneficiando de esa guerra. Sí, eso se puede tomar como justificación. Pero, así que para beneficiar a alguien, no, honestamente no.
Но судя по тому, что народ живет в Америке богатый в основном, то, наверное, внутренняя политика хорошая. А внешняя политика, многим мне не нравится. В частности, война в Югославии, война в Ираке. Америка берет на себя роль какого-то полицейского международного, хотя никто этого не доверял.
No country has the right to interfere in the internal affairs of one country. That's what the Bush government had done. So they say that they are working for peace. They're not working for the peace.
The situation has so deteriorated that there are now about 43 insurgent groups. Some of them are coming from the outside. Most of them are Iraqis. Some of them might have been related to the Ba'ath Party previously, and many of them are Iraqis who have been harmed in some way by the occupation and have become so angry that they've joined in the resistance. So there's all kinds of people who are part of the forces that are fighting the U.S. military, and some of them fundamentalists that we would want nothing to do with and that don't value the lives of civilians, and some of them are nationalists who just want to get their country back.
Возлагаю ответственность на правительство, на тех, кто принимал решения по захвату или там по действиям в Ираке, или там по Украине, по Грузии. Я считаю, что людям, среднестатистическому американцу совершенно все равно, что происходит в Украине. Вообще, знают ли они об этой стране, или не имеют представления, что они не знают, что такое Украина.
As a Canadian, I think the war on terror, and as a global citizen, I think the war on terror has contributed to destabilizing the entire world system. I don't feel any safer. I feel less safe. I think there are more people angry about the way that things have been handled by the Americans, and just the conditions that promote this kind of outcry by people around the world that resort to terrorism. Terrorism is the last resort of desperate people. But I don't think it's worth the billions of dollars in the debt that the U.S. government is incurring over Iraq and over this war on terror that's been perpetuated around the globe by the Americans on everybody else. They are terrorists by their own definition.
Even those Iraqis who welcomed the U.S., in a few months after the U.S. occupation, started to feel betrayed. They saw that, first of all, the way the Americans were treating the Iraqis with very little respect for their customs, their cultures, the disregard for the lives of civilians, the midnight raids where people were terrified in their homes in the middle of the night, the checkpoints where the Americans would be barking orders in English, and if the Iraqis didn't understand and went too fast, they would be shot at and killed. The random shootings on the street by the American troops when they were jittery and would hear something, they would shoot into the street and oftentimes just kill whoever was there. But perhaps even more than all of that was the takeover of their economy. And they were seeing U.S. companies like Halliburton and Bechtel come in and get the contracts for rebuilding, take not only U.S. Taxpayer dollars, but also take Iraqi oil money and use it for U.S. companies. They saw that their facilities weren't being rebuilt, that these companies were basically stealing their money and their jobs. And they said, wait a minute, how come during the first Gulf War, afterwards, we Iraqis rebuilt our own country in a matter of months? We had the electricity back on, we had the phone system back working, we had the sewer system fixed, and now under U.S. occupation, these things aren't getting fixed, so we're living without electricity, without telephones, we can't even get gasoline in the gas stations, and somebody else is taking the jobs. So a tremendous resentment from the economic standpoint.
يعانون ما يعانون عانوا ما عانوا كافي هذا شهر تموز واب اقوى واقصى ايام الحر هي بهالشهرين هاي يقدرون هم وكهرباء ماكو بالبلد يقدرون
July and second become very hot. Must the America make the electric and give it to us. We have a children, we have some family sick. My mother is sick, she needs the air cooler and she needs the air condition. So if the electric cut, where we go?
He's very angry.
Yeah.
قولي لها احنا مو ضدهم
مو ضد الشعب الامريكي.
We are not against the American people.
بس قولي لها انه العنف يولد عنف.
But violence brings violence.
Pienso que el presidente de allá nomás es por querer más gobernar a más países. ¿Sabes cuántos países va a gobernar Estados Unidos y son de los que sí, ¿no? O sea, o el petróleo que se quiere apagar la llama, imagínate. Así como dice, ¿no? No es gobernar. No, sí, pero o sea, yo me refiero a que, por decirlo, él, o sea, es más intereses de saber de conquistar más, o sea, más países que sean aliados para él y él, o sea, mientras más billetes para él o el petróleo que quieran para ellos, poner el presidente a cualquier país para ellos, porque pues esa es su conveniencia para que crezcan más como potencia, me imagino.
There appears to be a failure to understand in Washington that bullying is not necessarily equivalent to good international leadership, and small countries are particularly sensitive to political and diplomatic bullying, and New Zealand has been the recipient of that sort of bullying, particularly over the non-nuclear policy that New Zealand has had as a cornerstone, not only of its foreign policy, but also of its domestic policy since 1985. The Americans clearly do not have an understanding how much this non-nuclear policy means to this very green state.
Мое мировоззрение, мое отношение к президенту Бушу и к правительству Соединенных Штатов сформировано за счет всей их, так сказать, героической в кавычках истории. Ну, если мы взглянем на прошедший уже 20 век, то практически беспрерывно, так или иначе, шли какие-то военные конфликты, какие-то еще события, которые, как правило, были инициированы так или иначе этим государством, и в абсолютном большинстве они несли негативный характер и влияли очень отрицательно на миропорядок вообще и в отдельно взятых странах в частности.
I think they're dangerous because they have an ideological zeal and a sense of their own correctness, which hasn't been present in previous administrations.
Because you're living in a country like India, wherein you do have you do have a democracy, you do have secularism, where you have Muslims and Hindus living side by side, and you can't expect something happening in Iraq not affecting people in the country or anywhere else in the world for the matter. I think the world is seriously not a safe place, and I think US right now is not safe at all, and I think the repercussions are really going to, linger on for a long time to come, and it's just another September 9/11 waiting to happen.
Yeah, definitely we're doing that. Listen, another thing is right now there's U.S. troops are taking the camera away from a Japanese journalist, and they are actually a plane is actually breaking out right now between American troops and journalists, and they're arresting. They've actually detained the Japanese journalist, and they confiscated his camera.
راح نشوفك هذا جاك الجواد
مالك
Well, what the U.S. has done is commit war crimes. There's no question about it.
How can you call American intervention as war crime? In my opinion, I would say it's a humanitarian intervention. You cannot claim humanitarian intervention as a war crime. And secondly, international law is so ambiguous. One cannot say what is a crime and what is not.
War crimes are a very clear definition. War crime definition, according to Geneva Conventions, is that you cannot treat people inhumanely. You're prohibited from treating people inhumanely. As soon as you cross that line into inhumane treatment, it's a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. That's a crime under U.S. law. It's called a war crime. And those involved in it, not just the low-level guys who apparently did some of it, but the upper-level guys who, in our view, from Rumsfeld on down, authorized this kind of conduct, should be investigated and tried for war crimes.
I think that it's a bit of a misnomer to claim that what's going on in Iraq are war crimes.
There's no question in my mind that we have committed war crimes both in Afghanistan and in Iraq. In the case of Afghanistan, for example, when we were saying that Osama bin Laden was hidden in the caves of Tora Bora, we destroyed villages all along there and destroyed entire families. These are people who were among the poorest people in the world, didn't have electricity, didn't have access to television, radio, newspapers. When some of our delegates went to the makeshift clinics and saw people literally on their deathbed bleeding to death, and they asked our delegates, who did this and why? And we said, the United States, because we're looking for Osama bin Laden. They said, what is the United States? And who is Osama bin Laden? These people had no idea what any of this global terrorist network was about. And yet they were the victims of our bombing campaign.
Who likes to see that? I mean, to break it down, nobody likes to see people die. Nobody likes to see, innocent people suffering. So what's the reason? What's the basis? I'm sure we're all human beings. We're all educated, pretty much, most of us, right? So, and sort things out with a pen rather than with a gun,
Exactly.
kind of thing.
I was just going through the definition of a war crime, and it says it's an atrocity, it's either a crime or it's persecution of the people. And all the proof so far, the jails, the Ghraib jails, and all the kind of persecution on the Iraqis showed that it is a war crime. Actually, I think I would almost call it a genocide.
The nature of the war in Iraq is a unconventional, asymmetrical war of attrition between an established conventional military occupier, the United States, and what's left of the coalition of the willing, and then a guerrilla force of resistance that is a mixture of Ba'athists, international jihadis, and other Islamicists who have flocked to the fray, and then people who are engaged in criminal enterprise who are taking advantage of the opportunity presented by the security vacuum that is Iraq today. Unconventional warfare blurs the lines between civilian and uniformed combatants.
Greenpeace International sent a team into Iraq after the war was over, and basically we went in to look at the nuclear power plant just outside of Baghdad. Now, while the US guarded the oil installations and the oil ministry, it completely ignored the nuclear power plant, which was raided and looted by local people. And what we found was, we measured the radioactivity around the plant. We found high levels, thousands of times beyond the safety levels, in schoolyards, in villages, right around the plant. Now, the US didn't measure that, and the US wouldn't allow the UN in to do that either.
On the American side, what we have seen is individual instances of murder in particular being committed by troops. And those certainly will be handled within the U.S. Code of Military Justice. They're perfectly capable of handling these crimes. The larger question is whether or not things such as the torture in Abu Ghraib prison, and perhaps some of the bombing runs that were done during the first stage of the war, if those were in fact done deliberately, systematically, and in full knowledge that they contravened the Geneva Convention, as well as the basic laws of war, which say that you do not target civilian populations, regardless of whether or not there are military personnel hiding amongst them. You engage them as a combat force when they come out of the civilian population. To carpet bomb them under those circumstances may constitute a war crime. But quite frankly, it's very difficult because of the nature of this war to determine exactly where war fighting, legitimately construed, lays off and criminal activity begins, no matter which side of the fray you take into the equation.
We have worked as Code Pink with human rights organizations in Iraq that have files and files and files of cases of innocent civilians who were killed by U.S. occupying forces in all different circumstances, sometimes just on the street, sometimes at a peaceful protest, and sometimes during the midnight raids. But without provocation. The torture of prisoners, the lack of any kind of due process. There are countless examples of war crimes that the U.S. has committed in Iraq, and one day these will come out.
What they are doing to Iraq and what they did to Afghanistan is absolutely awful to me.
The only reason we know much about Abu Ghraib is because on April 28th of 2004, pictures were revealed about what was done in Abu Ghraib in a particular cell block. But Abu Ghraib is not an isolated incident. There was torture and abuse going out throughout the prisons in Iraq.
Before Abu Ghraib ever broke, we knew what was going on inside Iraq. We had been interviewing people in Iraq about their time in prison, and they told us horrible stories, crying as they would tell us the humiliation, the physical abuse that they suffered while they were being detained, and of course never had any charges against them, never had any access to lawyers. Their family members never knew where they were being held. We took these recorded interviews back to the U.S., took them to Congress, took them to the UN, took them to the U.S. media, and nobody would cover the story.
We have in one of our cases over 100 individuals that were tortured and abused in Iraq, and not just at Abu Ghraib, at prisons all throughout Iraq.
To be honest, I think that no press would be the best press. We could just come here, do our job, and leave, and if no one ever knew we were here, we'd be just as happy.
I think it reflects a general disregard for the lives of Muslim people that is generated from the top down. This doesn't just happen because there are rogue soldiers who go too far. It's a kind of mentality that has to come from above. And when the people like George Bush and Donald Rumsfeld send out messages that Geneva Convention is a quaint document, that we are now in war and under warfare, people are enemy combatants, not prisoners of war. These people are not at the same level as we are. They are not human beings of the same category that we are. They are lesser human beings. They are in the category of, quote, terrorists, and that means that they are sub-beings. When that kind of message is given off, it trickles down, and it trickles down in very dangerous ways that lead not only to the terrible mistreatment, but it reverberates against us, because the kind of hatred that people who are mistreated feeds the jihad, it feeds the armies of people who feel that Americans are their enemy, and really makes us less safe as a people.
What it really should be called is outsourcing torture. What it is a process by which the Bush administration goes all over the world and picks up people who it thinks are involved somehow with terrorism, or people who have information or should be interrogated. They'll put that person on a special CIA airplane and fly them to a country where torture is routinely used. We think there's been a couple of hundred cases of extraordinary rendition. The Center for Constitutional Rights actually represents one of the main guys to get out from under this. He got out only because he was a Canadian citizen. His name is Mahar Arar. He was picked up by the United States while changing planes at Kennedy Airport in New York. He was put on one of the special secret CIA jets. He was flown to Jordan and then into Syria, where he remained in an underground detention facility for 10 months and 10 days and was tortured. It's picking up people anywhere in the world, putting them into some security services that uses torture, and then claiming that the U.S. isn't involved in the torture. But in fact, of course, the whole purpose of this is to have people tortured.
1996, Republican Congress passed the War Crimes Act. Anyone, this means executives, responsible for grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions are subject not only to trial, but to the death penalty. George Bush's legal advisors were aware of this. Alberto Gonzales, now the Attorney General, his legal counsel who transmitted the memos of the Justice Department, actually advised President Bush to effectively rescind the Geneva Conventions, to say that they were inapplicable. And he explained why. He said because that will reduce the threat of criminal prosecution. If you conduct grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, like authorizing torture, then you could be subject to the War Crimes Act. That's when they introduced this concept of enemy combatant, which has no status in law, for maybe 70 years, in order to somehow say that the Geneva Conventions didn't apply, wherever they claim that they don't want them to apply, like Guantanamo. Guantanamo was taken from Cuba effectively by force 100 years ago, after the U.S. intervened in what's called here the liberation of Cuba, but was in fact an intervention to prevent Cuba from liberating itself from Spain. The U.S. forced Cuba to lease to the United States the Guantanamo region. So the U.S. has no business being on Guantanamo at all, and certainly you can't take seriously the claim that the legal system doesn't apply in Guantanamo because it's not under our jurisdiction. That's carrying legal sophistry beyond any limits that even allow ridicule.
The first clients we began with were the ones taken to Guantanamo in January 2002. At that time, we knew it was serious in Guantanamo because it's a place that the U.S., the Bush administration, tried to say no law applied and no court could look at. Clients that I interviewed there that we got released, 3 men from England, described for me being chained to a ring in the floor, having dogs come in while they were being interrogated, sexual humiliation, religious humiliation, having things happen to the Koran, a variety of very, very bad tactics that I think amount to torture and certainly cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment.
No sé si directamente a Bush, pero sí hay crímenes de guerra que se está pasando con las torturas. De hecho, creo que salieron unas nuevas, ¿no? Como que se nota, ¿no? Internacionalmente no hubo apoyo con la ONU. Yo creo que ese es el ejemplo más obvio, ¿no? De cómo era el consenso en general internacional, pues que ignoró, ¿no? Le valió ahora sí que madres.
An outlaw is someone that doesn't want to adhere to the laws that are created. So they adhere to these international laws, essentially, norms, protocols, conventions, and treaties. And the superpower, because of its strength, decides that it doesn't want to deal with these laws, that it doesn't want to adhere to these laws.
After World War II and the horrors of World War II, the United States was one of the big players in trying to get some kind of international community and international court together to try war criminals such as Hitler and so many since.
The United States is utterly and completely hostile to any kind of accountability for war crimes, and with that, totally hostile to the International Criminal Court.
Well, it's absurd, isn't it? And it's bizarre. It's like a farce to me. You do go out and accuse everyone else of doing a lot of things, and then you back out. Henry Kissinger, for example, I guess would be in there. And of course, they try to stay away, not to have their own people in the trials.
Now, this same country who is a forerunner of trying to make some of these things law 60 years ago is the same ones now who are backing out, saying we don't have to listen to international law. We don't have to follow the international community because we are so powerful and we are so rich. We don't have to.
The United States clearly wants to be exempted from a tribunal that otherwise would encompass the entire world, and that, by any stretch of the imagination, is simply not on.
There's a sense that the United States is not being a good international citizen. Is actually acting more like an outlaw rather than being someone that adheres to the global rule of law.
As you may have gathered, as usual, I'm working without the local law.
The International Criminal Court has been set up at The Hague. It's to investigate officials of a country when that country refuses to investigate.
So the U.S. is now virtually alone. Now, there are a few others, Israel, 1 or 2 others, that don't accept the jurisdiction of it. The U.S. has gone way beyond that, though.
We have the power and we have the money to buy loyalty as well as the power to enforce loyalty. And it seems that the United States has no qualm in doing that in either way.
It's demanded that other countries sign bilateral agreements with the United States saying that they will not ever bring any charge that might involve the United States.
And the reason that George Bush is so adamantly against the International Criminal Court is he doesn't want to be tried in the International Criminal Court, and he doesn't want anybody from the United States to be tried.
I guess Texas told you what's up here.
Yes, he did. He said there's a gang trying to put your stage line out of business. Do you know who they are?
Well, we got a pretty good idea.
Let's crack down on them right now.
Well, Ace has to have evidence, Bob. They're a pretty clever gang, covered up their tracks perfectly.
Well, you would like to think that after what our Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld authorized here, from the use of dogs to very heavy interrogation techniques, that there might be a place that he could be investigated and tried. The normal place you would go to in this current time would be the International Criminal Court.
In the family secret, there is a saying that you can have a hippopotamus in the living room. Everybody knows about it, but nobody tells. And in the world politics of today, the Bush administration's actions are as obvious as a hippopotamus in the living room.
Pues no ha llegado a ser un Pinochet, ¿no? Todavía, pero de abuso de poder, yo sí siento que sí ha habido.
Were we to have an international criminal court where the U.S. participated like it should, it would not just be people like Milosevic being tried or people like Saddam Hussein being tried. It would also be people like George Bush.
I think the international court is incredibly important, and I think Americans' attitude of not accepting its jurisdiction is ill-considered and stupid, and I don't think they should be in Iraq, and I think it is an act of war, and I think that they should be treating those Iraqi prisoners of war as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention.
They don't want to listen to the world. They don't want to listen to whatever advice anybody is coming up with, as long as not to within or from within, or supporting their interests. And that is it's a little bit dangerous for the world to be in that state.
Well, the U.S. has a history of do as I say, not as I do.
And interestingly, a large majority of the U.S. population are in favor of submitting to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. So it's not the United States, it's the U.S. government.
And has actually gone to other countries and say, if our soldiers commit war crimes on your soil, we want to make a special deal where we're exempt from the International Criminal Court.
Actually, Congress passed an act, which the President signed, which in Europe is sometimes called the Netherlands Invasion Act.
Giving the U.S. President power to use all forces necessary, including the Sixth Fleet, to, by violence if necessary, take free any American who is accused for war criminals in Holland.
Sometimes this has reached the level of absolute fanaticism.
Countries are guided by interest, what we may call it as national interest. And here, this case, that is American intervention in Iraq, if one would claim, no one can call upon the U.S. or no one can really ask the U.S. to appear before International Court of Justice because it has intervened in the larger interest of the Iraqi society. The Iraqi exiles and all those people and the Kurds who have been suffering under Iraqi rule, under Saddam Hussein, keeping in view of the development that has taken place under Saddam Hussein, U.S. intervention and U.S. action cannot be questioned. I feel it cannot be questioned in the International Court of Justice.
U.S. hates the International Criminal Court. It doesn't want to be held accountable for its own conduct in any court, whether in the United States or in the International Criminal Court. I think it thinks as the most powerful country in the world, why should it care at all about international law? international protections against torture, international protections against war crimes.
I think the whole of the international system and international relations is based on this notion of global rule of law. So if you have one major power not adhering to that global rule of law, then it gives the right for all the other countries who are much smaller and less powerful to do the same. It doesn't set a very good example.
I mean, all of this is so far out. If you were watching it from Mars, you wouldn't know whether to laugh or to cry.
Well, with the Bush administration especially, there is huge amounts of arrogance and contempt.
The U.S. stands above any rule of law, any international principles. We must have the power to do anything we want to preserve our strategic and economic interests. Our doesn't mean that of the population, because the population is against most of this.
We can occupy other countries just like we are occupying Iraq right now, but when Syria has troops in Lebanon, that is portrayed to the American people as, oh my God, how can we allow Syria to continue to have its troops in Lebanon? U.S. has its troops everywhere. I mean, U.S. has bases in about 100 countries. It is quite astounding where the U.S. has bases. And many of these countries don't want the U.S. bases there and have been fighting for decades to try to get rid of the bases, like in Japan, for example, like in the case of the Philippines.
I think the U.S. machine is unfeeling, period, to the rest of the world. I think the U.S. machine has one thing in its sights, and that's world domination, to make as much money as possible.
Because of the way that their policies are set up and the way that their government is structured, there is a lot of conflict of interest even within the upper echelons of the government. So you look at Dick Cheney and his direct connections to Halliburton, and you know, time and time again the Americans have told us that they're going to fight to protect their way of life, and if that means securing oil resources in Iraq or expanding corporate culture to bring all that money from the periphery to the core, of course that's going to happen.
If the United States undertakes some action in response to a challenge to its prestige, power, and authority, then no legal issue arises. I mean, I don't think even Hitler said that. That means if somebody threatens our prestige and we use force, that's legitimate.
It doesn't matter who dies. It doesn't matter if it's our side or their side. Preferably their side, I guess, in their view, but I don't think it even really matters that much to them. The only reason they would prefer to be their side is because then the public outcry won't be quite so loud as if it were our side.
The Bush administration happens to be rather extreme in this respect.
The U.S. government machine, the corporate machine which is driving it, has no feelings for the rest of the world.
It's not off the spectrum. So Clinton, for example, his doctrine, if you want to use the word, presented to Congress was that the U.S. reserves the right to use any means, including force, if there is any threat to what he called U.S. interests. That means access to markets and resources. That actually, taken literally, goes beyond the Bush system. I mean, Bush at least says, well, we have to concoct some sort of a threat, you know, Iraqi weapons of mass destruction or something. So there's a huge gulf between the executive branch, and supported by Congress, and the general population on this most central issue of international affairs. It's kind of striking to see the way that worked out in the case of Iraq.
Now what we don't want is that under Saddam and his clique, there were a few people who were beneficiaries, and the majority of Iraqis simply were spectators. We are creating now the same circumstance. The Iraqi public at large are spectators. There is a small clique who are beneficiaries, along with the international companies. So where is the real change?
The Bush administration has caused absolutely reprehensible backward steps in domestic policy, in foreign policy, in economic. It's economic piracy. It's ridiculous amount of cruelty. It's just the kind of basic philosophy that I think takes the country backward, keeps it back in the past. I'm not saying anything new here.
The words freedom and democracy are being redefined by our current administration. Because when you and I say freedom or you and I say democracy, it's very different than what Bush means when he says democracy.
It tells you about the elite conception of democracy. When they talk about Bush's messianic vision, it's for a conception of democracy, which means people do what we say here or anywhere else. Then it's democracy.
It's quite disturbing. And it's no wonder that the CIA, having backed up, various regime changes throughout the world and supporting corporate America, which is to the detriment of the entire globe, it's really no wonder that the rest of the world is up in arms about the various ways that their foreign policy has affected everything on the globe, from environment to social structure to politics of sovereign nations.
To have a certain degree of debate, you must accept foundational facts like the Bush administration has been harmful to foreign policy. Whether you care about foreign policy or not is one thing. Whether you care about diplomatic relations is one thing. But you can't, if somebody's going to say to me, no, other foreign leaders like Bush, well, that's where the conversation ends, because that's not true.
A distinction was made between what was called Old Europe and New Europe. Old Europe is the bad guys. New Europe is the hope for democracy in the future. So New Europe, the leader of New Europe was Aznar in Spain, who joined with Bush and Blair at the summit, essentially announcing the war. Old Europe was France and Germany. And so it went. Well, if you take a look at the distinction, there's a very clear criterion that distinguishes Old and New Europe. Old Europe were the countries where the governments went along with the opinion of the large majority of their population. New Europe were the countries where the government overruled an even larger majority of their population and followed orders from Crawford, Texas. Like Aznar in Spain. Turns out he was supported by 2% of the population. So that made him the hope for democracy in the future. Well, that tells you what the attitude toward democracy is.
This is not a democratic approach. This is a very bad precedent. This reminds us very much of British imperialism in the early part of the 20th century. We see the same old tricks being replayed, which economic exploitation were at the heart of it.
Недавно выступал какой-то американский деятель. И он сказал, что якобы нас попросило в Ирак прийти правительство Ирака для того, чтобы освободить народ и сделать его свободным. Никто не просил, это вранье.
We need to become very aware of what's happening in Iraq, because this is a big reason of why the world feels about us the way that they do.
If Bush would have been the president that was prepared to invest in the American people and in the role of America as a very powerful international player that is there to help to establish true peace, and there's a lot of conflicts going around, so there's a lot of work to do for them. I believe he would have been able to become a historic president, the size of a Nelson Mandela, for instance, but he chose to be aggressive, and in time this will lead to his political death. I'm quite sure about this. He can't be re-elected, but he won't be remembered as a president that Americans can be proud of. I'm quite convinced that this is not possible, and it's a shame, because he had so many chances to do so.
There is a difference between a great power and a superpower. A great power intervenes in world affairs in defense of its national interests. A superpower, and the United States is ostensibly the only one left, intervenes in the international system for systemic interests. That is, it intervenes in international affairs not for its own national interests, but to regulate the system as a whole, because the system is a status quo in which it is the dominant actor.
We like to think that we are known as the benevolent empire.
You're best in the world. You're chosen. You're the chosen people or the chosen country. You're the center of the universe. And in that position, you can allow yourself to do things that other people can't.
The United States is a superpower that acts merely like a great power. It projects force for national, not international interest. In fact, it defies the international community by its policy of unilateral preemption. And when you have a country that is a superpower physically, but with regards to its self-perception and its moral authority are at best a great power, then what you're looking at is a superpower in decline.
The Bush administration is acting like a psychopath. A psychopathic person has a grandiose view of him or herself. It's a grand person, and subsequently all others are less grand.
We went to a session not so long ago about the project for the new American century,
which in detail spells out how the United States should use this unique situation that they are the only superpower in the world.
A completely crazy idea of trying to dominate the rest of the world for another 100 years, as if we're still living in a world where one can easily, even with a huge military power, can easily dominate another country. History has proven that this is not easy at all, actually almost unfeasible.
As a Canadian, I see it every day. Like, there's no need for them to take us over officially because they own everything. It's a direct drain on our economy, us being their most direct and biggest trading partner. And look at what they did to the beef industry or the softwood lumber debates. The U.S. refuses to play by the rules that they dictate around the globe for this neoliberalist project that hasn't been working for the past 20 years. You really have to question how this policeman of the world act, why people are starting to catch on that it's farce.
When empires begin to act strictly in terms of narrowly defined national interests, they're soon to fall.
And this trend has continued even throughout 2004 and up to the Iraqi elections, where America is still being portrayed as the bully and as the one that's the aggressor and the one that doesn't listen to any other countries.
Nowadays, the United States is not viewed as a victim, but is viewed as a bully pretty much by everybody who isn't receiving money from the United States or some other sort of favor. Everyone else pretty much figures the United States has way, way overreached in their response to the terrorist threat. The second more damning thing is the United States has lost virtually any moral basis for claiming world leadership. What the United States is, pure and simple, is the biggest bully in the world. It's got a military that no one can possibly equal, either together, much less individually. It uses that military for its own interests. And as a result, it has alienated not only the Muslim world and a lot of the lesser developed world, who have always been somewhat at odds with the United States global project, but it has alienated some of its most steadfast and historic allies.
The United States will decline because of their enormous economical problems and deficits in the budget and the very vast spendings, military spendings.
One of the greatest things we have to worry about in the United States now is a huge economic collapse, especially with the Bush administration so quickly bankrupting the entire nation with this ongoing war with Iraq that they forced on the rest of the world. They're pouring money into. And you look at that. I mean, one of the reasons for going to Iraq was, of course, the weapons of mass destruction. Another was to free the Iraqi people. The Iraqi people deserve democracy. They deserve to be free. I mean, how many times have we heard this? And of course, the Iraqi people do deserve democracy and deserve to be free. Everybody does. But when you look at the population of Iraq, you've got 25 million people in Iraq. 25 million people. There are 50 million people in this country who don't have enough food, who don't have health care, who are starving. Twice the population of Iraq in our own country. And yet we're spending billions of dollars over there. I think we really need to start examining what we're doing, because logically it makes no sense.
We know that in America there's a lot of people in a lot of trouble, living in poverty, really hundreds, thousands, millions of people. And this is really in the nation where that is the #1 military power, economic power in the world. So that strikes us really. It's something we can't understand too good, how politicians in such a country don't care more about internal politics, about internal social affairs, which is an idea that we've developed. We're not better in any way, but we try to spread a little more of the wealth that is created here in Belgium. We do not understand how politicians in America can even become popular when they're not basing their politics upon internal American politics.
The real interesting question will be not so much how far the United States will decline, but what happens when the emerging superpower, which my reckoning will be China, when their paths cross. There will come a point where the declining superpower will be globally challenged by the emerging superpower. And that will be a very interesting and more than likely violent time.
The choices America, or the American government at least, is making now, and has been making for, let's say, decades, are not a very good basis to build a good future upon. And I believe that there's threats coming from all over. There's of course the uprise of China, but other economic powers are really doing well at this time, and one day they're gonna be a real threat to the United States.
They can't continue with that for too long, so I think that will make the difference in the end. And I think Japan and of course China will be even bigger powers in the world.
And I hope that by that time they will have the politicians over there will have spent enough attention to the population inside the country, because they will need them to survive anyway. They have to invest in the people of the country, and as many as possible, and not just a certain elite, because one day that will give serious trouble.
Because declining powers do not go quietly into the night. They go kicking and shoving and screaming, and the Chinese have both time, patience, and a lot of resources on their side, and none of the international commitments. If you look at China today, not only is it not involved in Iraq, but it's not involved even in tsunami relief efforts. It has no interest in helping others out because it's got a project of its own. And that project is the project of the emerging giant, and it's got its eyes squarely set on the declining superpower, because that's the rival that it has to get out of the way in order to establish itself as a global military and economic power. I see it happening within 50 years.
If you travel in the United States, you find that people are extremely ignorant about things outside their own country. So they are, I mean really that you can say the United States is isolated from the rest of the world. The people, the ordinary people of the United States.
You'll hear this, that we're a free country and they wish they could be like us. As if we were the only free country in the world, or as if we were the only democracy. We're not even the largest democracy in the world. India is the largest democracy in the world. So, you know, we have this notion that we are the only free country, or we are the only one. You often hear a protest when people don't agree with you. If you're at a protest saying, well, you better be thankful you can do this, that you're in America, because if you were in Iraq, they would shoot you or something, which a congressman actually said to me once, I quote, if you were in Iraq right now, they'd shoot you. And but you must notice that when they compare America to other countries, they always compare them to countries like Iraq or like, some communist or state under a dictator. They don't compare it to if you were in France or if you were in the United Kingdom or if you were in Canada or if you were in New Zealand, which are all places among dozens and dozens others that are just as free, if not more free, than the United States are, the people of the United States are.
What I discovered as somebody who had a chance to go to Mexico when I was very young and thought, wow, there's other cultures and people speak different languages and they think differently, and later worked for the UN and saw, wow, there is an incredible world out here. I realized that most Americans don't have passports, they don't travel, they see the world from a very, very narrow perspective.
I saw a figure that only 13% of United States citizens have a passport. And I think about all these young men and women who are acting as soldiers in Iraq, for instance. Most of them have never been outside their own state.
I got an Arab language book review of Sorry Everybody translated for me by a friend. And it was on the web, so there were comments from Arabic speakers around the world underneath this book review. And I would say half of them were expressions of unmitigated anger. I wouldn't necessarily say hatred, but they were just absolute anger that Americans could feel that this was enough to account for all the atrocity, that, people could possibly believe that, that an expression of apology is going to make any friends around the world, that it's going to change how they feel about America. But the other half of them were positive messages. And so I guess the answer is there's people in the Arab world that don't like America, and there's people in America that don't like the Arab world, and people are pretty much the same all over, I guess. So if somebody says that foreigners hate America, then that's jingoism, because foreigners are just like us. Some of them like us, some of them don't, and sometimes we deserve it and sometimes we don't.
Well, the whole idea of they hate our democracies or they hate our freedom or they're jealous of our wealth or all that, that is just an example, truly an example of talking points and of corporate-backed and government-backed, which is often the same thing, propaganda that's perpetuated through the media.
I think if we're looking at the pre-2001, pre-September 11 picture, America was portrayed as an idol, as something to go and look up to. There was a lot of Hollywood stories, a lot of positive stories about the economy, and a lot of things that not only the media, but I believe also people were looking up to, and this changed drastically from September 11.
The day after September 11th, we had the sympathy of the world. Everyone came to our aid, everyone sympathized with us. They looked at us saying, we understand you because we have been victims of terrorist attacks. We have been victims of these things, and we reach out to you.
It caused a total shift initially to a picture of feeling very much sorry to America, but which very quickly changed to a little bit of misunderstanding or a wrong understanding of America in terms of the aggression that it showed. And particularly when it came to the Iraq War, South African media became totally hostile towards America.
The Bush administration took, which could have been a major step towards world peace and further understanding now that we are all in this together. And he took it with arrogance and with brutality, crushed it. And now that once sentiment of outreach has become a sentiment of hatred and anger towards the United States and what they have done in the name of securing its own citizens. As if they are more important than the rest of the world's citizens, and that we can crush anyone else as long as it ostensibly makes us safer.
It hit me that if we don't solve kind of the whole issue of global militarism, that supersedes all the other world problems and causes most of them.
Because it's going to take a very long time before the United States can reestablish itself as anything other than the biggest international hypocrite.
So many people in the United States talk about how that they've attacked us. They attacked us on our soil. It's because of 9/11 that we have to go and defend ourselves.
The very fact that someone would attack them on their own soil with impunity is clear indication of weakness, that no one would have dared do this even at the height of the Cold War.
Where perhaps if we listen to what other people have to say, if we listen to why they hate us, instead of just going and brutally attacking them, if we listen to why, perhaps we can avoid another tragedy.
I think it's not important to dominate, not as much as they believe it is. It's far more important to create a state where it's good to live in, and all the rest, I think, will follow.
I guess the message to the world is to please be a little more patient with us. That I thought on November 2nd, we were going to send a message to the world community that we were ashamed of what our government had done. And I was really anxious to send that message to the world community. And it didn't happen. And I felt terrible about that. I felt like now they're just going to give up on us. Now they're going to say, okay, the American people don't care about the rest of the world, and they'll get what they deserve. I've since been outside the United States and found that they are still giving us a little more time.
I think the U.S. government is hated and feared. I think the U.S. people are not. I think the U.S. people probably are more pitied than anything around the world.
You know, they're saying, well, the American people have a media that doesn't show them the truth, have a government that lies to them, and so they are oppressed people. And we have to help liberate the American people. And that's a very beautiful way to look at things, that just as the U.S. is oppressing people in other countries, we are oppressed here at home.
The people of the world realize that we get different news. We get different information than the rest of the world gets. And so they understand that we can't make educated decisions in the voting booth or otherwise, or with our dollar or anything, because we're not getting the same information. I mean, there are entire stories that never even make it inside the media bubble that is the United States.
I think it's important to recognize too that while the American people did vote Bush in for a second term, which is questionable at best, it's not the people that this anti-Americanism is against. It's the policy and the government. And I think that is something that gets lost a lot of the time, and it does help the American people to get further up in arms about the fact that they are under attack from the globe and that they are all alone in the world. And I think we need to really try to be more inclusive about the fact that you are a part of us, you're not a separate entity, and you're valued as such.
There's relationships between states. There's relationships, between countries, like their governments, and there's relationships between just people, which one hopes and ideally are independent of country or affiliation or, the usual suspects, race, color, creed. And I think that Sorry Everybody hits something a lot more important than state-to-state relations, is person-to-person relations. Those are the ones that matter in our everyday lives.
And I think once we are able to liberate ourselves from a government that is oppressive, we'll be able to not only make ourselves at one with the global family, but I think we'll see a liberation here in the United States that will bring out the best of the American people, that will allow us to use our money, our know-how, our energy, our creativity to make things better for people here at home as well as people around the world.
Sorry is a beginning. It's the beginning of a real long journey, and it's not a journey that I thought I was taking the first step of when I wrote down "We're Sorry World" on a piece of paper.
We've got to start taking each other into consideration on a very human level, and not break down cultures and not break down traditions necessarily, but break down these walls that are dividing us, because we are all so very similar. We are all looking for the same things. We all want to feed our children and live in peace, and this is why we need to start talking to each other in open communication, internationally speaking.
It's a journey that needs to be taken, and I'm here and I can walk. So follow me or lead the way.
Hi, this is Corky.
I'm glad this project is happening. It's been one of those little adventure journeys.
Maybe get rid of Bush. I just
pretty much like brainwashed the whole country.
What do you think of the United States government?
Okay, I'll answer this one. Yeah. It's not bad and not below average.
Люди, живущие в Америке, я очень хочу вас всех узнать, потому что, наверное, где-то я вас всех люблю. Я очень хочу, чтобы вы любили и меня, и всех людей, живущих в России.
Хочу пожелать, чтобы для всех, кто смотрит этот фильм, этот год стал хотя бы чуть-чуть более счастливым и мирным.
Yo, papayas, pues porque te apreciamos un chingo. Mira quién te trajimos, cabrón.
Papayas, ¿cómo te he extrañado? Un saludo, que muchas gracias. Si me quieren mandar mi Oscar, estoy aquí en San Jerónimo.
And I hope that by this movie and by other and all the people who are trying to change things, that we will succeed in changing this pathological behavior. That's my sincere hope. Thank you.
Creo que todos queremos a nuestras familias, todos queremos al vecino. Y nada, a lo mejor a veces por egos o por razones económicas, a lo mejor se le olvida ese sentir básico del ser humano.